What if everything you thought you knew about the Vikings was wrong? What if these fierce Scandinavian warriors, the ones we picture with horned helmets, longships, and battle axes, actually share a genetic thread with people living thousands of miles away in East Asia? Not as a minor statistical blip, not as a rounding error, but as a match so significant that it made geneticists stop, look at their data again, and then look a third time just to be sure. That's exactly what happened. And today we're going to follow the story from the frozen fjords of Norway all the way to the steppes of Central Asia and beyond, because the truth about who the Vikings really were is far stranger and far more fascinating than any saga ever told. Let's start with what we thought we knew. For generations, the popular image of Vikings has been pretty consistent: big, blonde, Scandinavian. Norse-speaking raiders from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden who terrorized coastal Europe between roughly 793 and 1066 AD. They showed up, they burned things, they took what they wanted, and they left. Maybe they settled Iceland, maybe they touched North America, but fundamentally, they were a European people, Nordic, Germanic, white as the snow they lived in. That story isn't wrong exactly, but it is deeply, profoundly incomplete. In the last decade, ancient DNA technology has advanced at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. Scientists can now extract genetic material from bones and teeth that have been buried for over 1,000 years. They can sequence entire genomes from a fragment of a molar. And when researchers began doing this systematically to Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia and beyond, the results started raising eyebrows immediately. The study that really cracked things open was published in 2020 in the journal Nature. It was one of the largest ancient DNA studies of the Viking Age ever conducted. Researchers analyzed the genomes of 442 individuals from burial sites across Europe, Greenland, and even parts of Asia. The sample sites included iconic Viking locations in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the UK, and Iceland. And what they found shattered the clean, simple narrative. First, the basics that confirmed what we expected. Yes, many Viking Age individuals showed strong genetic ties to Scandinavia. They had ancestry that traced back to earlier migrations of hunter-gatherers and Bronze Age steppe peoples who had moved into northern Europe thousands of years before. That part checked out. But then things got complicated. A significant number of individuals buried with full Viking rites, weapons, grave goods, the whole ceremonial package that screams this person was a Viking, showed ancestry that did not come from Scandinavia at all. Some had Southern European ancestry. Some had ancestry from the British Isles, which makes sense given the amount of raiding and settling that happened there. But some, and this is where the story takes its unexpected turn, showed genetic signatures pointing toward populations in East Asia and the surrounding regions. Now, before we go further, we need to be precise about what East Asian means in a genetic context, because this is where a lot of people get tripped up. When geneticists talk about East Asian ancestry in ancient populations, they're using a broad umbrella that includes populations from East Asia proper, China, Japan, Korea, but also populations from Central Asia, Siberia, and the vast steppe regions stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. These populations are genetically distinct from Western Eurasians, and their presence in a Viking-era genome is something that needs explanation. The key to understanding this comes from a people most of us have never heard of: the Sami. The Sami are the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, Lapland, as it's sometimes called. They have lived in the Arctic regions of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia for thousands of years. And genetically, the Sami are remarkable. They carry a substantial proportion of ancestry that traces back not to the farmers and steppe herders who populated most of Europe, but to ancient Siberian populations with clear genetic connections to the ancestral groups that gave rise to East Asians. This Siberian ancestry in the Sami is not a recent development. It's ancient. It reflects migrations that happened during and before the last ice age, when people moved across what is now the Arctic and subarctic in ways that connected populations across enormous distances. And here's where the Vikings come back into the picture. The Viking-era populations of Scandinavia didn't exist in isolation from the Sami. They traded with them. They intermarried with them. In some cases, they raided them. The cultural and genetic interaction between Norse and Sami populations was real and ongoing throughout the Viking Age. So when researchers found that some individuals buried in Viking-style graves carried genetic signatures pointing toward East Asia, the most parsimonious explanation, the one that fits the evidence best, was that this ancestry was coming through Sami admixture. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the Sami aren't the only pathway. The Vikings were extraordinary travelers. We know this from the archaeological record and from the sagas. Norse traders and warriors moved east as well as west. They pushed deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine along river systems, establishing trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and beyond. The Vikings who traveled these eastern routes were known as the Varangians. They traded furs, slaves, and amber. They received silk, silver, and spices in return. And along those routes, they encountered populations from Central Asia, Khazars, Bulgars, and others, who themselves had significant East Asian genetic ancestry from centuries of migration and interaction on the steppe. Ancient DNA from sites along the Volga River and in the regions around the Caspian Sea confirms this mixing. People were moving, settling, intermarrying, and leaving genetic traces everywhere they went. So the East Asian genetic signal in some Viking Age individuals reflects something profound. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were participants in a vast, interconnected world that stretched from the North Atlantic to the edge of China. Their DNA tells that story even when their sagas don't. But the 2020 Nature study threw up another surprise that took even the researchers off guard. When they looked at the genetic diversity